Okay, so speed provocations, I guess, about accelerationism. It's striking that most ideas about accelerationism, both pro and con, seem to me to assume that capitalism is always more or less actually the same thing. It can affirm itself speeding up or become something else in the future. It can be negated, overthrown, but capitalism is always the same thing in all of these narratives. But is it? Is this still capitalism, or is this something worse, is what I would like to ask. And I've argued elsewhere we could imagine the commodity economy passing through 3 stages already: the enclosure of land, the mass production of things, and then the commodification of information. So each stage is a sort of distinct private property form, producing a succession or successive polarizations of classes, of owners and non-owners. And so maybe then the transformative possibilities change also with each stage in that development of the property form. Land enclosure produced the reactive and utopian peasant resistance. The mass production of the thing as commodity produced both the radical and the reformist labor movements. And maybe new forms of exploitation layered on top of these. Ongoing ones are producing new kinds of contestation and new forms of accommodation. I have a slightly different read on that to what Daniel did yesterday, but we'll pick that up later. So the new stage of commodification is less about extracting surplus value from labor, as extracting surplus information from play. It extracts value by offering information for free to us, but extracting more information in return, so hence surplus information. But this new form of commodity economy does not go unchallenged. The countercurrents it itself produces may not, however, be adequately captured by the language or the category of politics or the political. Maybe the struggle is, as Alexander Bogdanov would say, between commodification and the possibility of better or at least other forms of organization. The problem of organization is at once one of resources, techniques, human and inhuman forces, affect, information. So I think organization is a category that exceeds how we usually think of the political. Is it not strange that so much of what was once forward-looking leftist discourse is now so longing for the past? It wants its October a second time, or it wants its Lenin Christ Messiah. It wants leaps and events. It wants an autonomous sphere of political action at a time when any such autonomous domain seems clearly not to exist. The problem of modes of organization, then, I think, has to be posed again and outside the domain of political theory, which tends to assume a priori that politics is a relatively autonomous sphere. So, of course, political theory is probably preferable to an apolitical theory that sort of caves into a language of there is no alternative. But our alternatives have to be based on an analysis of current forms of commodity relation, not on some sort of ahistorical philosophical understanding of eternal capitalism. So I think we must restart what Castoriadis called the imaginary institution, by which organizations find the phase changes that are implied in their own form. By the rhetoric you shall know them. The talk these days is of disruption and creation, and of destruction and creative destruction. So the old language of the avant-gardes and the revolutionaries is now the province of Silicon Valley publicists. So we need to kind of carefully analyze that language and our use of it, our complicity with it. And perhaps we need a new kind of avant-garde. It's clear that this is a commodity economy busy cannibalizing its own means of subsistence. It's kind of run out of ideas. And the task of the neoliberal state, if that's what it is to kind of destroy the social so that it may be commodified, even though this will result in a less efficient and effective forms of organization. So let there be iPads in the charter schools. The result will be less effective and more expensive, but that is actually the point, right? That's the goal. The ruling class of our time is a rentier class. It is not actually innovative and disruptive. It's not actually accelerating anything. Technical innovation pushed commodification onto a new, more abstract plane, that of information. But the plan, as far as the ruling class is concerned, is to sort of rope it off and sustain quasi-monopoly, rent-seeking behaviors in those domains. The ruling class of our time, I call it the vectoralist class, wants information to be a mode of organizational control and not really of innovation, where there's some strong sense of the novus. So the challenge to this new kind of Baroque order is entirely within its relation to its material conditions of existence at the base of the stack. So in short, negation, to the extent that it's a category, always comes from below. There is no negation from above. There is no other domain of absolute alterity which will rend judgment against this Gomorrah. There is no communism as avenging angel of pure universal equality. There is no absurdist leap into the unknown. What calls the vectoralist class to account is the now systematic quality of its own disorganization. First but not last on the list, ever rising levels of atmospheric carbon. What will spark a disruption is a leap in food prices, not philosophy or art. The commodity economy is not what Althusser called an expressive totality, infecting any and everything with its poison touch. It isn't everything. It isn't even all capitalism, but rather a kind of heterogeneous mix of commodity and non-commodity organizational modes, even if some of the non-commodity modes are there, in a sense, a reproductive mode for commodity forms. So commodity forms themselves then also, as I suggest, differentiate into at least three kind of historical forms, making land, capital, and then information over into forms of private property. So since capitalism is not a totality, its negation is not total either. And that's sort of where I'm breaking ranks with the Benjamin Noyes version of this story. One needs a language of organization that is both more abstract and more specific, which articulates together heterogeneous forms and goals. And in this respect, I think the legacy of Laclau and Mouffe and Stuart Hall and so forth is still with us. Critics of accelerationism might say that I too lack faith in total negation. Yes, indeed I do. I am a person without faith. But this clears away what Debord called the silly chatter of optimism and opens up a space for strategic thinking. The most difficult thing for any organizational thinker is to think the orderly retreat. And in many respects, the orderly retreat might be the task of our era. Which is not to say that one lets go of utopian imagining, even if it's more the queer cosmos of Charles Fourier, to which one might turn, than the exterminating angels of St. Paul. So a qualified accelerationism then, maybe one which does not accept that capitalism is either a historical or the transforming thing in itself, or that it's actually progress, but which does not put too much faith in the past or a mystical other. I think the challenge is to do better with the various infrastructures to hand for organizing the world. There's a certain charm in the language of what E.P. Thompson once called exterminism. After 2 millennia of failure as the abstract thought of a human-centered world, perhaps philosophy could skip that part and become the thought of a world without us. And that's one way of reading the goal of a certain turn it's taken. But perhaps the problem is not with correlationist philosophies, but with philosophy to court. If philosophers were going to save us, they would have done so already. I call it. It's 2,000 years, guys. Enough, okay? It's time for quite different kinds of organization of thought in other webs of relation to the world. Now, I'm not against abstract thought, right? But to think the organizational practice of thought rather than thought itself, where we just assume the organizations and institutions go on. Like, that's really the challenge. So the problem of thought is an organizational one. Let's be done with the spectacle of master thinkers. There's no going back then. We need a new temporal jazz connecting pasts, presents, futures. But let's think of in a more plural fashion, and with those others, who kind of think that temporal jazz. Let's put, I got a misprint here, accelerationism together with, for example, the Afrofuturism of Kodwo Eshon, the gender de-engineering of Beatriz Preciado, the techno-feminism of the late Shulamith Firestone, and many others. Let's try to think at scale again, and with a certain historical legato. Certain accelerationist writers have resorted, someone called it the Accelerationist International yesterday, which I thought was hilarious. Some in the Accelerationist International, I feel like saying, have rewarded, I think, to a fairly shop-worn mode of sort of abstracting from differences and having be done with all of that, so that white guys can get on with what they do, I guess, and I'm calling that, okay? Someone has to call that, and I've not seen that done. So the white guy will call that. So we need rather a new kind of abstraction, one which does not flatten such differences again by simply sort of reasserting the old patriarchal norms. Asking Dad to plan a future for us is just not going to fly. There can be no large-scale planning based on an abstracted rationality of the old type. Infrastructure henceforth has to be a sort of a big mesh of little things rather than a little mesh of big things anyway. We've so destabilized the bedrock on which infrastructure rests that it becomes increasingly failure-prone, as so traditionally conceived. Accelerationists like Williams and Schnenek are right to ask that we think at scale again, and that I think is an important insight from them and from Ben's talk yesterday, which to me was incredibly refreshing in drawing attention to that. Because the enemy certainly thinks at scale. Philip Morawski has given us the plan. First, lie about the reality of climate change for as long as that will work. Secondly, cap and trade to create a new market, without actually thinking about the commodity form all that much at all. Third, geoengineering to counteract the effects of atmospheric carbon without actually reducing emissions. So the solution, in short, is more of the same that ails us. You essentially just build the same thing, more and increasingly in the same direction. In short, there's nothing that won't be sacrificed to the perfection of private property, including, in the end of the day, life itself. But I think we need to acknowledge that buyout power is not the state's primary object, and in fact never was. Yes, states are arming themselves against their own populations. States are conducting surveillance of their entire populations. What this means is that the state is preparing to defend property against us, if necessary, which is, after all, the first and last mission of the state. Right? The state aims not at the body or at life, at property. Property is its central category. So, property, first and last mission of the state, but you can smell the fear. This is a ruling class that, in its quiet moments, knows it has failed its historical task and is preparing for the worst. Our task, then, is the hardest one, orderly retreat. Even if this bankrupt and enervated form of organisation based on commodification were to disappear tomorrow, the material conditions of existence are still against us. But if you want a past historical hook, it's not the storming of the Bastille, it's the retreat from Moscow. Yeah? We have a whole culture of political philosophy. It's based on the storming of the Bastille as its founding myth. But the retreat from Moscow, the board is the only one I know who really takes that as the central thing that has to be addressed. And that is, if you like, the allegory with which one can work. So can we build, in that context, can we build an orderly retreat on the weak power of weak social links? Can boredom, indifference, opacity, and ambivalence of abstracted sociality become a positive force? Can we be data punks? Here's 3 gigabytes, go form your own society, might be one possible reaction. Can we be metapunks? Can we manage our own metadata, build transversal organizations in the shadow of the proper channels, even through them, just opaquely? Can we be a vast and anonymous support group for those who are prepared to put their bodies in front of pipelines? Because I'm not going to do it. I'm not even a citizen. Could we even be infrapunks and think not about what's being carried, but the carrier layer as exactly the thing that discourse was always all about? Can we be done with contemporary art? I kind of feel like not reading this paragraph now. Like, we did this last night. It's like, I don't want to beat on art. I love art. But look, art, if you're an artist, if you can make a living at it, good luck to you. We all have our day jobs. Yeah? Can we treat the successful artist as just another person with a day job and ask that their real work be actually something else that's more interesting? That the actual art of our time is organizational or not at all. And ask what Marx called the property question. Like, if it's not asking that, it's just not anything really interesting. Like, that's the central category of inquiry, it seems to me. What's interesting in an aesthetic practice is if it proposes organizations of resources that might partially decommodify while working with real constraints. Yeah, is to have some, both the pragmatic and the utopian in the same phrase seems to me to be what's actually how I read the Situationists. It's actually not an extremist. It's a quite tactical and cunning way of threading those two things together. Contemporary art. It's just useless things for useless people, right? Take the hedgies' money if you can get it, but just not their sense of worth. Our model, I think, is someone like Eugene, who took the money from his collectors and with it funded the greatest avant-gardes of post-war Europe. That's his real work, yeah? That's his real genius. Now, the avant-gardes that Eugene supported were precarious ones. And here in what the Situationists so charmingly call the overdeveloped world, that precarity is now a general condition. The ruling class wants to collect the rent, but it doesn't want to actually employ any of us at all, yeah, if that's avoidable. Business as usual requires less and less actual labor, whereas a qualitative shift towards a kind of post-carbon mode of production would actually keep all of us busy for decades, yeah? I tell my students this. It's like, if we were actually doing this stuff, we'd all be working, yeah? I teach liberal arts students. So it would be their job. They don't engineer it. Their job would be to explain it to people. And it's like, we've got to change the qualitative practices of how we make everything. We'd be busy. We'd be working. But such a shift, waged against a ruling class, now in possession of a state that makes few structural concessions to us, would require organizing a social movement of many components. If we are to properly name the politics of our time, it actually isn't neoliberal. It's a kind of fascism. Yeah? I mean, it seems like a ridiculous thing to say, but I think we can call it. Yeah? Consent is now only secured by designating out groups to hate. Yeah, it's the takers and the makers, remember, was the careful phrasing of the last election cycle. The offerings of the times are so paltry, they can only be made to seem meaningful by making others suffer something much worse. And it's time for a new kind of popular front against that kind of fascism, I think. And what could our place be in that larger movement? Yeah, I mean, that seems to me to be a more pressing agenda in some ways. Like post-Fordism, neoliberal, incidentally, it's a poor name for the current mode of production, right? And just even that one needs modifiers tips you off to this. It draws attention to an old feature, not to the new ones. It properly names only, I think, features of a state and what a state enables. The liberal state disciplined the market, whereas it's the market that now disciplines the neoliberal state. We need a new language to describe emergent forms of commodity economy. It's not neo-anything or post-anything. It's not late capitalism. It's not cognitive capitalism, yeah? Modifiers won't do. The current mode is based on kind of ontological mutation, the historical production of the category of information. Like, that's what needs to be thought, and it needs a new language. That's why I love the accelerationist stuff. I don't care about the politics. It's new languages of describing things, yeah? And I find immensely appealing, regardless of Nick Land's kind of craziness at the end, you know? Like, the descriptive language of some of it is beautiful. So the historical production of information as an ontological reality is a product of the organizational challenges of the Cold War. And it's interesting, as Ben mentioned yesterday, that both the Soviets and the Americans had their different modes, with their different modes of production, whatever we think they were, both arrived at it. Like, they both built it out in these different ways. So the historical production of the reality of information was actually relatively independent of strictly capitalist relations of production. But for the moment, the promise, that's a heretical thought, by the way, you're not supposed to, you know, that there's any autonomy to the technical is a thought not allowed, but I think one has to explore that and allow it. Because when you watch people engineer, you see it. It's in the margin sometimes. One has clients and so forth, but it's not all determining. So screw Heidegger. You know, this is my screw Heidegger paragraph. He's just wrong about lots of things, yeah? Can we just call that one? But for the moment, the promise for another mode of organization is sort of still trapped in the exclusivity of the commodity form. Maybe one always needs some version of the commodity form, but it's the entrapment of ever more and other modes of life in it that may be the problem. So this may be a rather new and strange commodity form that I think needs some sort of new language, a new affect, a new aesthetic, new images that we actually don't really quite have. As Jamison was saying, you know, some years ago, we just really don't even quite have an image of it. Although Metahaven seemed to have almost pulled that off. I was kind of like, yeah, that's what reality looks like. Thank you. All right, so the new form of the commodity, information, is producing new kinds of class relation. I'm not going to go into that. I've done that elsewhere. But here, the avant-garde finds its classic role available to it again, to experiment with the forms of everyday life of an emerging class. I mean, I think the great historic avant-gardes, that's kind of what they're doing, in a sense. But it's maybe not of the order, and you notice little residues of the futurist language in the accelerationist discourse, but it's to maybe sort of misperceive the poetics and politics of language of the moment. Because all of that language belongs to the publicists of Silicon Valley, or Silicon Alley, as I was suggesting. They're the ones who want to disrupt and whatever. So, like, maybe our goal is finding, you know, new kind of, not even new, but any kind of zone of consistency where other modes of life can pertain, yeah, and play. That might be a better way to describe it than always being in that new and succeeding, which just puts you into the commodity cycle, yeah, which none of this discourse is free of, let us just know. One can no longer quite say, workers of the world unite, we have a world to win. So, first draft, maybe data punks of the world untie, we have a world to lose. You know, it's not great because I'm just doing simple détournement, but we need a new language. But I do like one Michel Bernstein came up with a little while ago, which was monsters of the world unite, and that at least describes my people, if not yours. But it strikes me there are projects as yet described, and what's appealing to me in accelerationist discourse is actually more that, you know, sort of, it's not even quite speculative, it's kind of like free-range poetics. It's trying to describe and denote an affect of the time, out of which we might then be able to fashion a kind of an abstract language that grasps what is essential and not merely a residue of how we thought about another century. So the Situationists used to talk about leaving the 20th century, and we failed at the task, but perhaps we could leave the 21st century. On paper, at least, we have longer to do it. I thank you.